Welcome to another episode of Let's Talk Faith and Aid, brought to you by the Humanitarian Collaborative at the UVA Batten School of Public Policy, a limited podcast series exploring how faith can drive humanitarian action and how it might inspire a renewed call for compassion and collective response. I'm Laura Howell, a student fellow with the Humanitarian Collaborative. In this episode, we explore how faith can shape how humanitarian aid is trusted and delivered, and in the U.S., how it operates both as a deep motivator for giving and a platform for advocacy. Kate Katch, a practitioner fellow, will speak with Bill O'Keefe and Kevin Hartigan, two seasoned humanitarian leaders and close friends for over 30 years. Bill and Kevin are from Catholic Relief Services, or CRS, one of the largest international organizations working in the humanitarian field. They were the largest NGO recipient of USAID funding, operating in more than 100 countries. Bill is the Executive Vice President for CRS, overseeing advocacy and government relations. He's been with the organization for 38 years. Kevin recently retired after more than 3 decades with CRS, leading programs across Latin America, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. They'll explore why talking about faith matters.
In Afghanistan, people understand why people act on their faith. That's a concept that is well known. What they don't understand is people who don't have any faith.
The role of faith and charitable giving, specifically in the U.S.
We look at rural America and assume the people are just completely closed off from the world, but in fact, their churches and their faith communities are windows onto that, into a more cosmopolitan view of that. Encourages that generosity and the trust.
And their insights on how faith could be used to mobilize and to advocate.
There's a lot more church-going people in Congress and in Senate than there is in that. It's unrepresentative of the population. Yeah. So essentially, that does give us a way to appeal to those people.
Now pull up a seat, put in your headphones, and let's talk faith and aid.
Bill and Kevin, welcome to Let's Talk Faith and Aid. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. Really glad to be here. It's going to be fun.
I wanted to start with looking at the big picture of faith and humanitarian aid. I wonder, from your perspective, do we actually need to talk about faith and how it relates to humanitarian assistance? Is it simply a personal belief that motivates some people, or is there a reason we need to be considering the role of faith more broadly in our humanitarian work?
The paradox for us always is, on the one hand, we want to maintain a complete non-partiality in the humanitarian work itself. But on the other hand, I think it's important for us, when we go and do this work, to understand that we're almost inevitably going to be working in a very religious society. Everywhere I worked in my life, in Africa, Asia, Latin America, I would say, maybe with the exception of Eastern Europe, were extremely observant, extremely religious societies. So if you're talking about going into these places, working with local partners, basically we're coming out of a fairly secular society and working in religious societies as international aid workers. I think it's important, and it's been important for so many of our colleagues to understand that, because frankly, talking to people about international charters and treaties signed in the early 1950s, that does not resonate with a lot of local people on the world. But appealing to and finding common faith-based principles and precepts is a way that we can bridge that divide.
I totally agree with everything Kevin said, and we'll remind him of something. I think he and I were traveling in Afghanistan together in 2008, I want to say. And I remember talking to some of our staff who communicated to me that in Afghanistan, people understand why people act on their faith. That's a concept that is well known. What they don't understand is people who don't have any faith, and that it was harder for them to relate to that than to a different faith, like the Catholic faith. There was a box for Catholicism, and I remember at the time also talking to members of Congress who would say, "Oh, Catholic Relief Services, you guys must be having a terrible time there." in Afghanistan. And I said, I mean, it's a challenging environment, but actually people really understand.
Yeah, I attended a conference on religion humanitarianism years ago, and I was with the head of the research unit of Doctors Without Borders. And they found, to their shock, that some enormous majority, say 90% of their beneficiaries in Africa, thought that they were a Christian missionary organization. And they were first appalled by this and
Wow.
then realized on further examination that this was providing a lot of security to them
Huh.
because they realized that in terms of their acceptance in these communities, that even though many of them were not Christian, even Muslim communities, that when they did try to explain the kind of secular humanist origins of
Mm.
the organizations, their beneficiaries found it very off-putting and very hard to relate to and kind of suspicious. And so they realized in these societies, that's what people understand charity to be motivated by.
I recall CRS helped to rebuild some mosques and some Islamic religious facilities. Why? Because that's how people get through this experience, and that's how they
Yeah.
turn to a critical part of normalcy in their lives. And if you don't do that, you're basically leaving out a major part of their identity and their humanity. And I think CRS has
Yeah.
this integral human development view of its work. We're looking at people as whole people, and that includes spiritual, psychological, physical, and other dimensions. And that's just a major part of what a full recovery and response
Right.
for us would be.
It's necessary to support religious institutions in these emergencies because those institutions are also essentially the primary local institutions that provide both humanitarian assistance in emergencies, so that you have an
Mhm.
enormous outpouring, just like you do from churches down in Texas right now for these floods. If you have a normal disaster, in most of the spontaneous aid is organized through mosques. So if the
Right.
mosques aren't functioning, that's a problem. But the other thing is that these are societies where there are very, very few mental health professionals as we would know them. People get their counseling from their imams, or their mullahs, from their priests and nuns or Buddhist
Yeah.
monks. These are I would say, the psychological first aid
Mm.
providers, right? It's extremely important to support that role of civil society. You can't look at or think about civil society in these countries without understanding how much of it is tied to faith and their faith traditions, just like you couldn't understand civil society in the response to the floods in Texas without understanding local churches.
So, if faith is so important to the populations we serve, and if the majority of the populations we serve are religious, and just some research that we were doing and looking at, even just looking at countries with UN humanitarian response plans, and we found that over 90% of the populations in those countries affiliated with a religion. And then actually in many of those countries, it was much higher. It was 95% or above. So I'm curious for your thoughts on, if that's the case, then why is there a hesitancy to talk about faith in the humanitarian sector? I've been working in this field for almost 20 years. And in the international humanitarian policy community, I feel like faith is something that is rarely touched upon. I'd be curious, why do you think that is? What are some of the criticisms about integrating more of discussion around faith in humanitarian action?
The first thing is, I do think that there is a perception, or has been historically, and a sometimes legitimate concern of proselytization by faith-based institutions. And I think that that line has sometimes been crossed by groups. And when that's happened, I think it's really hurt the whole
Mm.
kind of faith sector, because it's perceived in other societies as kind of cultural imperialism, colonialism, in a way that is really unhelpful. I think at CRS, we are clear about who we are, what we are motivated by, but are also crystal clear, both in terms of word and deed, in terms of assisting people in need and not creed. And I think that that's certainly helped us. But I do think that fear is out there. And again,
Mhm.
for reasons, some of which are are true or based on experience.
Right.
So I think some of the people involved in humanitarian assistance and in UN organizations and such are just themselves operating out of a strict interpretation of the American separation of church and state as applied to everything. We could talk about what's working or what not in our own society, but if you want to help people around the world, that's just not a good model to follow. It's just not accurate for how the rest of the world operates. That's what I think. I don't know, Kevin, what do you think?
I think the dangers are obvious, right? Of proselytization. The other big danger and the reason that faith-based groups would get a bad rap is discrimination or tribalism, right? Or basically the idea of like only helping Catholics or only helping Armenian Catholics. And I think that those are dangers that need to be constantly policed. But I would say there, we have a slight advantage as a faith-based organization. That's a danger. And you're looking out for it. But honestly, our secular sister agencies run the same risks because their national staff, their local staff are also members of the community and are all like part of faith groups. And the important thing about when you're doing humanitarian work with local faith groups is to do it with all of them, because a lot of them will have a particular relationship with their constituency, right? So they will know where all of the Syriac Orthodox families in need are, and they'll be able to identify them. The important thing is that you just need to work with all the faith groups, and you need to have all those faith groups represented in your staff. But those are real risks, and those are the kinds of risks that some people will cite to justify excluding or marginalizing faith-based groups from humanitarian work. And the aversion is mutual. So a lot of faith-based players in disaster relief, particularly, but in humanitarian work in general, will not show up for those weekly cluster meetings. For one thing, a lot of faith-based groups don't rely on the same funding sources, and they don't feel that they are respected or listened to in typical professional humanitarian club kind of meetings. The two systems avoid each other, and we can see it significantly particularly in these big disaster responses, where an enormous amount of the actual response to any of these cyclone in Bangladesh is actually coming from the local community, and it's coming through mosques and faith-based groups. And it's pretty much invisible to a lot of the professional aid organizations, and then even the international, whether it's Islamic Relief or the Adventists or whatever. Again, they don't rely on UN money, perhaps, and so they're not showing up for those meetings. And so there is just professionally a bit of two different worlds here.
So what do you think then needs to happen to try to encourage more discussion around faith in the humanitarian community? It sounds like there's valid concerns as well from secular organizations, but also a reluctance maybe to engage from some faith-based organizations. But if we think it's important to have more dialogue on the role of faith in humanitarian action, do you have any words of advice of what needs to be done to maybe overcome some of these challenges and be able to have more open dialogue about it?
I think the angle is the localization, right? Because you really can't localize your work without taking into account faith-based organizations at the local level. And I say, anywhere we work in the world, your alternative when you're trying to avoid faith-based organizations is you end up with a very small and usually urban group of maybe secular civil society organizations that are inspired by more of an internationalist or a global language and view of international commitments, but I would say have pretty low resonance in the rest of the population, or local government, which is problematic in many other ways. Whereas the permanent structures and also the actual respected leaders in many of these communities are the faith-based leaders and faith-based organizations. And it's these organizations that have permanency, whereas a lot of the shelf life of government and of secular civil society in many of the countries where we work is pretty brief. And so if we want to make investment in those relationships and in strengthening organizations that are sustainable, and also in just being able to intervene, intercede, to deal with conflict, security questions, you name it. If you are not dealing with the people who are the most respected leaders in these communities and who are looked to with relation as authorities, you're just not going to succeed in this. And so again, it's just recognizing like what kind of societies we work in and who matters.
So in essence, if we want to shift to a more locally led humanitarian response, there isn't really a choice. We have to be willing to have more discussions with and partner with and have that dialogue and build those relationships with local faith-based organizations and groups. Okay, I want to shift a little bit now to the role of faith and funding. Obviously, everyone's very aware of the significant funding cuts that have happened. I wanted to talk a little bit about individual giving and the role of faith. I was really struck by some data from last year that showed that US individuals gave over 390 billion in charitable giving, which blew my mind. And that the research shows that religious affiliation in the US is a good predictor of one's likelihood to donate. So 65% of weekly churchgoers in the US donate to charity, compared to 41% of those that don't attend a church. And we have seen in the face of the funding cuts and the collapse of USAID that there seemed to be this outpouring of financial support from the faith community. I understand World Relief raised around 3 million in private donations over a couple of weeks. The Church of Latter-day Saints announced 634 million in global spending. So I wanted to see what's Catholic Relief Services experience. I know you lost around 50% of your funding, which was really significant. What have you seen from the individual faith community over the last 7 months, and why do you think that is? Why don't I start with you, Bill?
We've also seen very significant outpouring of financial support from our donors. We have unbelievably generous donors, and I think our research of those donors is that they are overwhelmingly church-going Catholics, not only, but certainly overwhelmingly. And we have exceeded our annual projections by 20-30% and feel very blessed to have that. We've also got a lot of support. You mentioned the Church of Latter-day Saints. They're actually a very generous partner of ours, and they support Catholic Relief Services. We partner with Islamic Relief, and I think they fund us in some places where we are strong. We have funded them in places where they're strong. So there is this kind of solidarity among some of the religious organizations of working together. The question of why, to me, again, another like understatement of the century here, the United States is an extremely individualistic society for lots of reasons, historical and other. And I think, if anything, that seems to be growing in that kind of libertarian approach of the individual. And I think people of faith have another stream of belief about the connectedness to other people and shared responsibility. And I just think that that, to me, explains the difference in giving. If you go to any religious service, at the root of it, and again, not that every service is the same, and it's not that the preaching of social responsibility is always there, but the core text, the core beliefs of every religion have something about we are not alone, we are part of a community, we are part of a broader community, we're part of humanity, and we have responsibilities there that we just cannot walk away from. And so I do think that that matters, and we've certainly seen that at CRS over the last 7 months, which has really just been inspiring.
That is wonderful to see, but I think it also gets to trust. I agree with Bill. I think that there could be two things going on here, though. I think that would be the reason, as Bill described, why a church-going or a person of faith would be more likely to donate. But I think looking at it the other side of like why these people who don't identify with the faith are not giving as much is, I think, partly that person of faith has an organization they trust to give the money to. The Latter-day Saint faithful trust their church. The Catholics in the pews trust Catholic Relief Services. They know what it is. People who are not tied to a faith community in the United States just don't have that. A lot of people just don't know where to send their money, right? What organization they can trust. When the quake happened in Haiti in 2010, it turned out that 400 churches in America had sister programs, mission programs in Haiti, many of them Protestant evangelical groups from throughout the United States. And that means that all of those communities, including, again, our little community here in northern Wisconsin, I talk to local people, the local church has like a mission support program in Sierra Leone, Guinea-Bissau. Their churches are opening them up to the world and giving them that sense of connection, but also of responsibility and solidarity. We look at rural America and assume the people are just completely closed off from the world. But in fact, their churches and their faith communities are windows onto that, into a more cosmopolitan view of that. Encourages that generosity and the trust. Because I think a lot of people, if they were sure of where they were giving their money, that they would give more.
That's really interesting, because I think it's showing that faith is a motivator to give, and it's not necessarily about giving to the same kind of faith. It can be giving to another organization with different faith, but that there's also this trust component and this personal connection component. Bill, I was reading the testimony that you gave back in April to the House Committee, I believe it was, and you talked about the principle of solidarity being rooted, and I apologize, I'm probably going to say the Latin here wrong, but in Ordo Amoris, which teaches that love for God must be followed by love for one's neighbor. And there's been a lot of debate this year in the Christian community around what does our neighbor actually mean? Does it mean our immediate next door neighbor? Does it mean just those that are within our national borders, or does it extend beyond that? And I wondered if you could just touch a little bit upon that, and what your belief is, or what the Catholic belief is around who is our neighbor.
It is such a relevant question in our politics right now, I think, and in the evolution of foreign policy in the United States and American attitudes towards that. My own perspective and that of the church is that, frankly, everybody is our neighbor. All people are created equally in the image and likeness of God. And as such, if you know of someone's suffering, you may not be responsible for it, but you have a responsibility to at least be aware of it and within your own abilities and capacities to do something about it. I used to joke at people, well, I still joke with people at CRS that I worry that life will be discovered on Mars, because then we will have an obligation to assist it. Because really the Catholic principle of solidarity extends to all people and asks that we have a firm and persevering determination on behalf of the common good. It's a great challenge, but I think one that ultimately opens up people's hearts. And I think when we don't accept that challenge, and we kind of look at our neighbor very narrowly, our own hearts shrink, become smaller as a result of that. And I'd say the same about our country. You know, when we refuse to acknowledge our own responsibility in the world, I think we become a smaller country, kind of metaphorically. What is the point of being the most wealthy, powerful in the country, in the world, if you don't use that for the good of others? We're like a bunch of dragons sitting on a pile of gold. And that's not what Jesus Christ or God wants us to do as a country, I think.
I love that notion that we often think about the expansion, right? Like what it costs us to help others elsewhere. But I love the idea that you bring in that when we don't, we ourselves shrink. We actually become less. And I think that's a great insight. And so that leads me to think, or to ask, do you think organizations that are secular based, do you think they can tap into individual faith-based giving? Or is that something that is much more difficult for them to do because they're either not a faith-based organization, or is it that they're struggling to make individual connection, or there isn't the trust there?
Two things. First of all, we know that many of our generous donors give to other groups as well. And so
That's right.
generosity is not a single destination
Yes,
journey.
I love
So
that.
that's the first thing. That those 65% of weekly churchgoers are also giving to Save the Children and also giving to CARE and also giving to Mercy Corps based on their own experience and connections or whatever. So I think that's the first thing. It's just that there is a privilege of place and connection that Kevin mentioned that comes from being a member of the community. Obviously, depending on the person, religious language and the connection with the individual motivations that folks have
Mm.
is something that
Mhm.
I think secular groups will just not be able to do and struggle with. It's not something that can be faked. So I just think that that is a constraint. But I also talk to my friends who work for different organizations in my position, and they've got lots of religious donors. I think probably the 80-20 rule applies here. 20% of the people are giving 80% of the donations for a whole bunch of our
Yeah,
things. And
agreed. I love that comment. Generosity is not a single destination. I think that's so
Mhm.
true. So I want to shift a little to advocacy. In today's political landscape, many humanitarian organizations have shifted their messaging to ground support for humanitarian aid in the economic and the security kind of interests of the US. And I feel like appealing to that sense of moral obligation has been something that faith-based organizations have always been very good at doing. It's always been part of your advocacy to Congress and individuals. I wanted to get your reflections on, is faith still a unifying value that could renew this sense of global solidarity for humanitarian assistance? And if so, in these times that we are in, how do we practically do it? How do we get across divides and use faith as a way to really reignite this sense of shared values and commitment to helping others? Bill, I'd love to your reflections on this.
yeah, I'm going to break it down in two ways. First, in terms of motivating people, we have clearly a colossal sectoral failure to adequately communicate and engage American people in this enterprise of assisting our brothers and sisters around the world. I think all of us feel like, what went wrong? How could we done this better? I think lots of reflections from former USAID staff. What could they have done more of? Without getting bogged down in the past, we have a huge job, and I think we in the faith-based community, through our constituencies, we just have to keep doing more, play the long game about making these connections between our faith and our responsibility to give and support those around the world. And in the Catholic world, Catholic teaching about the responsibilities of states and governments
Right.
to play a role in solidarity. And I think, again, that argument has not been made by me, by the church, strong enough in my own personal opinion. A lot of work there. In terms of
Mm.
advocating to the government, let's take the Congress. The Secretary of State has said everything the US does has to make us stronger, safer, and more prosperous.
Hmm.
Seems to point away from the moral view. My experience is that when you actually sit down and talk to members of Congress, talk to congressional staff, talk to people in the administration, they're all people and they are motivated and they want to do generally the right thing. They have political reality, and part of our job in the
Yeah.
raw politics of it is to provide the space for them to do what they know is the right thing. At this point in time, though, we feel, and I really feel very strongly, we have to get back to first principles. So we are going to be, and the testimony you referred to earlier was really about a Catholic vision for international assistance that lays out the responsibilities of the state, lays out the responsibility
Mm.
of individuals in the supporting of the state, and makes the argument for the need for and the type of foreign assistance that's consistent with the broad teaching of the Catholic Church, and that I think is shared in many ways, in most ways, by other religious bodies. We've got to educate members of Congress about that so that they can dig into these issues and understand them better. There's so many new members of Congress who have not been participating in the long history. I've been with CRS for 38 years. So if I were a member of Congress who just got elected and I'm 42 years old, I've been working in business or something, I don't know anything about this stuff. And so we're trying to meet those people where they are and say, let me tell you, just step back, why this is important, what it does for our country. What I talked about earlier makes us the country who we want to be, who we can be proud of, where we can go to sleep at night, you member of Congress, and feel like you're contributing to the common good. And I think we've got a lot of work to do there, but that's, I think, what we need to do, and that's what we're going to do.
It's so interesting, that idea of having to re-educate, because I think for so long there was just this reliance on that the US had this very strong bipartisan support for humanitarian aid. it was almost taken for granted. And I think this idea that we have to re-educate why it's so important is really interesting. When you look at the funding that's coming from individuals, that what we're seeing at the moment isn't that people have lost faith in humanitarian aid and the need to give, but there's this loss of faith in the government and the role of the state in providing humanitarian aid, or what the boundaries are around that. Is that the right kind of characterization?
I think that's right. We have a huge challenge in this current media and social media environment where what gets likes and shares in algorithms is outrageous stuff, and explanations of complicated truths and realities with nuance somehow don't come to the top of your social media feed. The Catholic Church believes that ultimate truth is discernible through faith and reason. Kind of low on the faith side and definitely low on the reason side in our public discourse.
Yeah.
And so somehow that is an added challenge. And honestly, a lot of us are talking about that. Nobody knows what to do about it and how to compete in the competition of ideas, how to compete against this just widespread mis and disinformation that has helped to erode the trust that Americans have in what their government is doing.
Do you have any ideas or advice of what could be done? How could we be, as a humanitarian community, together be advocating more and trying to increase the support for it? Kevin, do you have some thoughts on
Yeah,
this?
just to say a couple things, and this is what Bill does. I think a lot of this is more effective because Bill spends a lot of his time, and I know CRS, a lot of our time, building coalitions and bringing these messages to government, to our legislators, as coalitions of faith-based groups, right? Coming and speaking together for a voice. So not just the Catholics or just the Methodists or even the Islamic groups, but coming together as faith-based coalitions to appeal.
Yeah.
And I think the one thing that you have going for you, and Bill knows this better, but we talk about the United States as being a not very religiously observant population, but the legislature is a more religiously observant subculture of our country than the rest of the population. And the political scientists have demonstrated this before, that interestingly, Americans, even who have no faith, tend to elect people of faith because there's a tendency to trust people if they claim to have a faith.
Interesting.
And so you end up with our elected officials. There's a lot more church-going people in Congress and in Senate than there is in that. It's unrepresentative of the population. So essentially, that does give us a way to appeal to those people, because they are, many of them, people of faith, and they're observant people, whether Christian, Jewish, Muslim. And they also, honestly, that is part of their brand as a politician for many of them. And Bill, I know I'm saying this from outside of the world of advocacy in Washington, but that's my impression.
Oh my God. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. A lot of politicians are more comfortable talking about their faith than lots of other people.
So maybe it then also increases the responsibility on faith-based organizations to be really increasing that advocacy with Congress and using that faith connection. So as we wrap up our time together, we have one final question. What insight or message would you want listeners to walk away with on faith and humanitarian action?
I guess the reflection would be, I think it's important to look for signs of hope in our industry, in our business right now. The resilience, solidarity in the US population, and particularly in the faith-based population, is an indicator of long-term hope. That the moment that we're going through right now in our politics of extremely insular, anti-cosmopolitan approach was not necessarily reflective of the US population's feelings about the rest of the world. And that wellspring of support and concern for their fellow human beings among Americans, and a lot of that inspired and fed by their faith communities, is the reason that we should be hopeful.
Bill, how about you?
We all know, those of us who have experience in development and humanitarian assistance, the only sustainable, deep responses are ones that are owned by the local community and local organizations. And that means engaging with faith institutions and on issues of faith and faithfulness. From a personal perspective, I think to do this kind of work, particularly at this time, takes some sort of faith, a faith in either a God, my God, someone's God, a faith that there is a purpose and a good greater than oneself, and that giving of service is an important part of living a meaningful life. And I just think that that's the only way that we can have the hope that Kevin really mentioned. That's what's going to carry us through this period, and that's what's going to help all of us to build a better world and feel that we've done our part.
Thank you both so much for your time today on Let's Talk Faith and Aid. We've really appreciated it. Until next time.
Thanks so much for listening to this limited edition podcast from the UVA Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy's Humanitarian Collaborative. If you enjoyed this episode, consider sharing with your friends and followers and visit our website for more resources.